Hello there everybody. So this is going to be a video on a topic that I've wanted to cover for quite a while now because it concerns one of those words that we throw around a lot in our everyday language, but if we really stop to actually consider what it is that we're addressing, we often find it's much more difficult to frame into words. And so today I want to give a concise description of the uncanny, referencing from two essays that have been written on the subject, one from Sigmund Freud and the other by a psychiatrist called Ernst Jentsch. And I'll provide direct links to both of those essays in the description bar below if you want to read them. Anyway, I really just want to get started with this and not waste any more time, so let's see what we can find out about this. The precise nature of the uncanny is not an easy thing to pin down because, like all similar activity, it arises from within our psychological arena and therefore it lies outside of the boundaries of confident measurement. And despite being accounted for universally, the uncanny does not occur in the same way for everybody. For example, we could both encounter something that provoked it in you, whereas I would not feel it, and vice versa. Despite this, however, there are some familiar characteristics to the uncanny that we can distinguish, and it does seem to arise more often under particular circumstances than others. So the first problem is to qualify the proper characteristics and to understand the respective context in which the uncanny arises. The Oxford English Dictionary describes the uncanny as strange or mysterious, especially in an unsettling way. Now, that's all right enough as a general working definition, but it doesn't really give us access to the uncanny in respect to its real nature. It's a bit like giving an account of the sun by saying that it's big and it's hot. It doesn't really give us a sophisticated picture of what we're actually dealing with. So, in order to go beyond the confines of the general definition, we're going to need more context. Sigmund Freud said that the uncanny is that class of the terrifying that leads back to something long known to us, once very familiar. Now this is better. You see how he puts it into a class of the terrifying? So it's not terrifying as such, it's more like a subset of it that distinguishes it from the major. And the last part of it is also really telling, where he says, it leads back to something long known to us, once very familiar. And that's a nice segue into what we're going to do right now, which is go through a brief journey into how the familiar and the unfamiliar affect us psychologically. And through that, it'll provide the foundation that we'll need to understand how the uncanny arises when we experience it. So when we encounter something new for the first time, we typically enter into a trepidatious phase of exploration surrounding that new thing or situation. And this is completely necessary for us because quite often it takes us a while to really soak in all of the variables of a situation before that we can feel confident about working with it. And what stems from this is that we come to naturally associate that which has been assimilated with a sense of confident mastery over that thing, whereas that which is unfamiliar is usually treated like a mysterious foreign agent that might potentially disrupt the harmony of our world space. The new possibility might be novel and intriguing, certainly, but it's also charged with an atmosphere of uncertainty and unpredictability, and therefore the survivalist mode within us treats the subject with caution until its boundaries can be clearly determined. We might encounter this when we first start learning a new skill, such as learning to drive, for example, or when you started your first day at university and everybody is there in the classroom waiting for the lecturer to come in, and everybody's all quiet and nervous kind of on the first day. And in that situation, that anxiety is produced because all those brains haven't figured out what the boundary definitions of that environment are yet. Who is this person? Who is that person? Is this person likely to be more open to me or more friendly to me than that one, for example? And sometimes it takes a few days or even for some people a matter of weeks before all of those people can walk into that lecture room and feel more at ease with the variables in that environment. So just to reiterate that the unfamiliar brings with it a potential for inquiry and growth, but also a lot of nervous apprehension until the boundary definitions can be worked out. And with time, the new situation becomes familiar, which in turn generates confidence, predictability, and we feel a reduction in anxiety around it. Alright, so now we're getting a lot closer to the source of all this, so let's ask this question. How can a state of anxiety and unease, usually attributed to the original phase, creep back into something that has now become familiar? That's what we're going to have to figure out, because it's in this where we see the emergence of the uncanny. It's not in the totally terrifying, and it's not in the bizarre pushed so far into the abstract that it becomes overwhelming. It's where something that was once taken to be familiar now starts taking on unfamiliar characteristics. And out of this strange dichotomy, a state of unease is created that we could categorize as uncanny. When the unfamiliar arises from within the familiar, it produces an internal conflict that the brain can't factor into its original category. So that part of our brain still remains active, confirming to us that what we see is the familiar, and yet the familiar is appearing or behaving in a way that negates the conditions that have made it familiar, if you see what I mean. Like when we see the figure of a person in the crooked form of a tree, or when a plastic doll opens and closes its eyes as if to imitate a living thing. In fact, mechanical automata are often excellent provocateurs of the uncanny, because they are inorganic objects moving and operating as if to imitate something most familiar, which is organic movement. We also see this a lot in computer models of human figures. The computer models are trying to simulate facial patterns, and they're built on really complex feats of digital engineering, but due to the acute sensitivity of the human eye and the brain, we perceive that as something disturbing to our sense of the familiar, and in a sense what's most familiar, because we're dealing with the body's impression of itself, which probably adds to the unease somewhat. So for something to provoke the uncanny, we have to experience something that our brain qualifies as familiar appearing or behaving in an unfamiliar way. And with no positive way to satisfy this dilemma, the brain automatically engages our fight and flight mechanisms, which then sends us into a state of defensive posturing before that which flies in the face of our familiar categories. And in closing, just to add to this, just because there's still a rational part of our mind that knows that the crooked tree is not a real person, or that the animatronic doll is not really alive, that doesn't do anything to banish the emergence of the uncanny in us, because on some essential primitive order of our mind, we are conflicted by it, and the evolved defense systems emerge automatically as a proactive measure. The uncanny is like a faulty equation, which manifests as an intruder at the level of consciousness. So that's all that I really wanted to say about the uncanny. If you do want a more detailed overview of it, you're welcome to download a couple of the PDFs in the description bar below. Though for now, I think I'll just say thank you very much for watching, and as usual, I'll see you again.